All right, everyone. Welcome to another exciting Hyper LinkedIn Live. We will work to get you out of here quickly today. We have a great session on how to build a workforce identity strategy that actually works. We recently published a really terrific white paper where we partnered with several Fortune 500 CIOs and chief security officers on exactly what it takes to roll out a workforce identity strategy. And particularly around identity verification, and even more importantly, how to work with your internal teams to get something like this budgeted and approved. So without further ado, let's talk about how you can actually achieve this. We'll run through the process, share some best practices, and then we'll wrap things up. So the process that we see being most successful in enterprises looks kind of like this at a very high level, and we'll walk through each of these steps in a fair amount of detail. But there's a foundational phase where we'll talk about really preparing for an identity verification process for your workforce in particular, and this is really catered around helping organizations move away from knowledge-based factors when verifying employees. Right? Everybody knows that if you're picking up the phone and calling an IT help desk, and they're asking you some basic questions like the street you grew up on and your manager's name, these things are easy to phish, they're easy to steal, they're easy to circumvent if you're a hacker. And so we're going to talk about some of the foundational things. Then we'll talk about how do you roll this out to a broader set of users? Who are those initial folks that you really want to pay attention to? How do you expand this rollout, perhaps globally? Many of the companies that we work with have operations and significant employee populations in dozens of countries. And finally, how do you optimize the process, right? So once it's rolled out globally, how do you find ways to streamline the identity verification process across various personas and user populations? So without further ado, let's talk about the foundation. Number one is figure out where your gaps are, right? And so in identity verification in particular, the most common gaps that we see are the help desk, right? So we mentioned earlier, does it rely on knowledge-based factors, right? Can the help desk be social engineered, right? Can the help desk issue a credential to a user or maybe even a privileged user that maybe they shouldn't have permission to do, right? The other gap is, what is your onboarding process? Is the person that you interviewed consistently the same person who joins on the first day of work? And making sure that you have the correct answer to that question every single time, whether it's a remote employee, a contractor, a third party, or somebody who even works in an office. And 3 is, do you have gaps where people are potentially outsourcing their jobs to other countries, or maybe there's a worker imposter type of situation. So this is probably the news that you've seen where organizations are hiring North Koreans, or individuals are maybe just outsourcing their jobs to cheaper resources in other countries. But figure out what your gaps are, and figure out where you can fix the problem the fastest, and ultimately where you're feeling the most pain. And so this requires really going across your business and working with different stakeholders. So for the onboarding piece, you may have to really partner with HR. For the credential reset or help desk piece, you may have to partner with your IT team if you work in security. If your organization has a workforce workplace design or workplace digital workplace streamlining team, you might need to work with those folks, but figure out like where you need to fix this problem the quickest and find that quick win that you're looking for, and try to figure out like what the escalation procedures might be if you detect one of these attacks happening within your organization. The second phase is controlling the rollout in particular. So How do companies actually roll out modern identity verification technologies for their workforce? They typically pick a very specific use case or a very specific user population to do this with. And so what we're seeing across our customer base is, hey, we're going to start doing this for the brand new people that we're hiring. So we're going to make sure we incorporate strong identity verification into our hiring process. And we're going to make sure that when we onboard individuals on their first day of work, we know that it's the person that we interviewed, and we know that we're going to onboard this person securely, and we're not going to issue them a shareable credential as part of that process. You can run this in parallel with your existing process as well. So you can do a phase rollout where, every other person, you have them go through this verification process, and then you do an A/B analysis afterwards. And this is where you also learn a lot, depending on your corporate culture, the different personalities, the different personas you have within your organization. You may have to tune and tweak the verification process depending on maybe the user's geographical location or whatever else, or maybe just their willingness to go through more friction, especially if they're a privileged user. Phase 3 is the expansion phase. So this is really where once you've gotten comfortable with changing the identity verification process internally, whether it's for onboarding or your help desk or otherwise, you have to start thinking about, how do I deploy this globally, right? And so this is where privacy laws especially can come into play. If certain countries in Europe and other continents have very strict laws around gathering biometrics or storing biometrics or using biometrics in any sort of capacity, especially on employees' personal devices. So you have to find identity verification methodologies that adhere to the laws in those local jurisdictions. You have to figure out how do you make sure that you're able to still get the highest level of assurance possible and never falling back to a knowledge-based factor to verify somebody's identity. This is also where you may have to integrate with various human capital management pieces of software. So if you're using something like Workday or similar, you may need to integrate those components into your identity verification process. And depending on the geographic reality that you're dealing with, you may have to integrate with multiple human capital management systems or identity platforms. We see in many organizations that have grown through acquisition, they sometimes will have multiple identity silos. So they'll have one set of users in Entra, as their user management layer. They'll have another set of users that are maybe in Ping or Okta, and they want to have a consistent set of verification controls that they can implement across those. So being able to hook into those different sources of truth is really critical as you think about expanding the initial group of users that you rolled out stronger identity verification for. And then phase 4 is the optimization phase. So after this, we'll cover some of the best practices as well, but optimization is really where you think about, how do I apply identity verification in a continuous manner, right? So right now, when we verify an employee's identity, the vast majority of our organization, they treat it as a point in time effort, right? So they do it once at onboarding, or maybe they might ask them some questions when they call the phone and pick up help desk. But in a world where many of us work remotely full time, that's no longer the right thing to do. We have to think about what role does identity verification play in a continuous manner for our business, right? If somebody starts a job on Monday and then on Thursday, they take their credentials for that job and they hand it to somebody in a different country to do the job for them, how do you detect that? How do you make sure that you are continuously able to verify a person's identity? And so what we're seeing organizations start doing is, as an initial phase, requiring that employees or contractors, or maybe just their remote workers, go through some sort of identity verification process, maybe every quarter, every twice a year, or every year, at least to have a baseline that they continuously are building towards. Here at HYPR, we do it every 2 weeks, but we're a bit draconian in our approach. But there is a need in order to create a identity assurance baseline in a continuous manner. And what you can also do here is if you have zero trust pieces of software, such as CrowdStrike or Zscaler or other tools that are able to give you more signals, you can combine those signals with the capabilities that HYPR provides in order to use identity verification as a step up. So this is where you can take advantage of a lot of the other tooling that you've invested in your IT and security program, and use those signals to determine whether or not you need to re-verify somebody in real time. And this is also where you really have to think about how do you optimize for the best possible user experience. So you'll learn that in certain geographies, people have a really difficult time doing something like scanning a document, right? But a biometric verification check could be much more feasible. You'll have situations where biometrics are not an option. You have to rely on peer verification. This is where you really have to think about what process is best for which group of users. And the tool that you're utilizing for identity verification has to be able to deal with the enterprise type of reality, right? So it needs to be flexible enough to deal with these various personas and use cases. But the one thing that we really want to note, which is critical, and we've seen companies implementing identity verification really struggle here. And one of the things we've seen is sometimes by implementing new processes, companies tend to leave a user stranded, right? And that is frustrating for everybody, because when a user cannot be verified and given access to the work environment, obviously they're not being productive. That is a cost to the business. That is an impact on their job performance. And so there's a lot of downsides. So how do you make sure that an employee or a user is never stranded as they're going through your identity verification process? So what we're seeing here is users have to have choice, and you have to be able to dynamically change the process that a user goes through to verify themselves depending on what they're able to do, right? So if a user comes in and they're on a brand new device, maybe they don't have their Entra verified ID if they had one previously on that new device, right? So they can't use that as a factor. So they might have to use something like a sync passkey or a SMS code. If a user can't share or is unwilling to share their location, that shouldn't necessarily mean that they can't be verified, right? Maybe you require them to do something else. We've seen companies really struggle with document verification sometimes for certain user populations, right? If a person can't scan a driver's license or a passport, they should still be able to be verified. So this is why it's really important to be able to provide multiple workflows for users to get through in order to still get through the verification process. And that's why really at HYPR here, we implemented a peer vouching system where if an employee is going through an identity verification process and they can't share their location, or they're having trouble scanning their government issued document, or maybe they just don't have it on them, we can put them in a text and video chat with somebody they work with or their manager or whoever else in order to really still have a strong verification process that they can go through. All right. So to round things out, the 4 phases of rollout that we've been implementing here are the foundational phase, where you're really working to figure out what is that key use case that you want to unblock users for today. Maybe this is a pain point that is felt by your security team or your IT help desk or your HR team, and really partnering with those folks to identify that key initial use case that you can implement a stronger identity verification process for to get tremendous business value. 2 is have a canary group of users, right? Do A/B testing, figure out what the right workflows are for the different personas within your environment. Phase 3 is figure out the complexities of expanding this capability globally, right, and across your entire organization. Even if your organization isn't global, you probably have different personas within your business, right? The amount of verification required maybe for a highly privileged system administrator might be very different than a intern on the marketing team, right? So you have to be able to have flexibility in that process. And then phase 4 is optimizing for the user experience, for security, for behavior, and really making identity verification a continuous process rather than just point-in-time checks. All right, well, thank you all for joining me today. Hopefully this was beneficial. We will link the white paper that we published around this process that goes into a lot more detail to this post.